So welcome to everybody who's joining us. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today for what is the second series or second part in the series of LAPADA Leaders. And really, we started LAPADA Leaders to meet people from the kind of leaders in the art world, antiques, design, cultural institutions, and kind of be able to have some access in these times where we can't kind of meet, and to take inspiration and also learn a bit from everybody. I suppose what we would have liked in an ideal world is this was supposed to be a live conversation at the LAPADA Fair in Berkeley Square, but sadly we can't run that this year, and we look like we're set to do the webinars for a little bit longer. So thank you so much for joining us. And this one is quite a special one because we're celebrating 60 years of the Inchbald School of Design, and it's a fantastic kind of marriage and story that has antiques and interiors and design at the heart of the story. But what I'd like to do first is just do a quick introduction to all of the speakers, and then we will get on with the conversation. For those of you who haven't joined us before, you'll see at the bottom there is a Q&A field and a chat field, and if you want to add in any kind of comments, do that in the chat. If you want to ask some questions which we will put to the panel at the end of the session, then just pop them in the Q&A field, and we will ask towards the end of our conversation this morning. So first I would like to introduce you to Jacqueline Duncan, who has an OBE, and Jacqueline founded the Inchbald School of Interior Design in 1960, and extended this to include the Faculty of Garden Design in the 70s as well. Jacqueline has an amazing kind of history of experience in working at the Michael Inchbald Studios, antique dealing, and really professionalising the design industry. She's also served on the Copyright Committee and the Monopolies Commission. And I think one of the things that is also quite interesting of the Inchbald is that they started doing these online courses in 2007, where they really brought almost their entire curriculum on there. So they've been fully prepared before any of the other kind of universities and schools for this kind of COVID nightmare where everyone has to work from their home. And then moving on, we have Monique and Staffan from the Tollgard Design Group, and they graduated at the Inchbald School of Design, so we can have some stories from there as well. But they are renowned, so they then set up their own design studio in 2005, and they're known for the kind of a fusion. You can correct me if I'm wrong, so this is sort of slightly from looking at your site and having some conversation, but for this fusion of kind of Asian and Scandinavian functionalism, as well as kind of bringing in key pieces that are sculptural furniture and working at sourcing amazing craftsmen as well, and kind of bringing those into your design. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. And then last but not least is Giles Kime, who is executive editor of Country Life magazine, and has also edited Decanter, so kind of fuses some of the passions that have been keeping us all sane during this lockdown of wine, art and interiors, and he's written several books on the subject as well. So I think we have a very informative panel, and my only anxiety is whether we can kind of have a conversation in the time that's allowed to us, because we've got quite a lot to cover. So what I wanted to do really was start, because we're sort of celebrating the 60 years of Inchbald, was really start with you, Jacqueline, and kind of set the scene of why it was necessary to found a school sort of devoted to interior design in the 60s and in London.
Am I answering directly?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
How many hours do you have for me?
Well, I think if we can keep it to, you know, a few minutes, this first question, because we've got a few questions.
The thing is that we were the first. There was a school that started in the 30s and folded in 39, and it was very small, but there was no, and she offered me her library and I never took it. We actually modelled Inchbald, I did, on Parsons School of Design. Parsons was started not as Parsons, but it was just the name change, in the late 19th century and in New York. And this is why the New Yorkers were so far ahead of us in terms of a structured profession. And the other thing about the American market, it was a mobile market, mobile clienteles. Every time they moved, they redecorated. And, you know, England was a very static clientele. And if we look at the English style, which is developed in a rather curious way by John Fowler and one or two others, but very largely with John Fowler, it was a layered look. They use that phrase an awful lot. Were the upper classes too idle to hire a decorator? Or was it that there were no decorators to hire? In the aftermath of the Second World War, everybody was selling their houses or actually pulling them down, as we all know. And there were 2 or 3 mansions a week hitting the dust. And the owners of those mansions were actually moving to smaller houses. And so the antique market was a joy for anybody interested in antiques, because it was flooded with the most beautiful antiques. And most of the beautiful antiques were actually very viable in terms of price. And so I moved into the interior design world and the antique world at a time which was an awful lot of fun for everybody dealing. I enjoyed myself hugely. But gradually, the American influence came in. The American House and Garden was a great influence. It was the influence at the time. And we suddenly thought there's more to decorating than appears to be the case. Michael Inchbald had, before I met him, had a spectacular exhibition in Peter Jones. Have you ever heard of that?
Absolutely.
The most dreadful thing is that it must have been photographed. I had 2 or 3 photographs, but somebody said, you must go and see this marvelous thing in Peter Jones. And Peter Jones wasn't the most exciting shop, but it was much more exciting than Harrods at the time. And so I went. I couldn't believe it. Michael was a great connoisseur, and he'd collected a marvelous collection of everything from Thomas Hope onwards and backwards, and had put various things together with a sort of modern look. He put bright Schiaparelli pink with Victorian lacquer, and you know that picks up the pearl in the lacquer, so that I came away with a completely different thinking on the matter of interior design. Then I met the designer. Oh, I said, did you design that? And I was deeply impressed. They got rid of him, poor old Michael, because, and they wrote him the nicest sacking letter I've ever read. It effectively said, you're so far ahead of us in what the public wants that we fear that we'll have to get somebody with more management ability. And it impresses you. I mean, the courtesy of that employer was incredible. But I remembered when I started putting the school together, I thought management is terribly important. They've got to be not airy-fairy, but terribly efficient. So
before we go back into the school, which I'm going to hand over to Staffan, but Giles, I wanted to pick up on Jacqueline's comment of, was the aristocracy too idle? Or
oh dear.
I love that.
I think, I don't know if they were too idle. I know that country houses in those days were supposed to have been fantastically uncomfortable. So I think when John Fowler came along, you know, it created an amazing opportunity to sort of bring them up to date and make them comfortable. But I think also there was a tradition on great country estates that they got the local curtain maker, the local upholsterer to do an awful lot for them. They probably felt there wasn't necessarily a role for an interior designer.
Yeah. Good. So Staffan and Monique, who both sort of students and learnt your craft at Inchbald, how do you think the Inchbald sort of differs maybe from other schools? Why did you choose to study there, and what did you take from it?
Okay. No, we were talking about it this morning. I think when we first thought about interior design, we had at least 2 careers behind us at that point. We'd met on the set of a film shoot, and then I was the actress and he was the first AD. So always interested in telling stories, but obviously, you know, a different chapter awaited. And when we did up our first house together, Staffan was still working as a film producer, and I read in House and Garden about the top 10 talents to look out for in interior design, and I think all of them were from the Inchbald. I think it was an article about the Inchbald and its top 10. And, you know, one of the stars in the rising was a 45-year-old former banker, which you don't hear about in most industries, right? Rising star, yeah. 45. And I said to Staffan, I think you should do this. You're really talented at it. You are obviously passionate about it. You know, your mom recalls you choosing your own wallpaper at 11. Why didn't you think about this? So take a sabbatical and go and do it. And, you know, from that point, you know, he then hired someone out of Inchbald the following year. I went to Inchbald the year after that. We've had, I think, 4 of our most senior people from Inchbald, because there's something about the school, to Jacqueline's point about, you know, organization is also king. It's not just creativity, right? There's a huge amount of additional organizational skill that goes into being an excellent interior designer. Something about that left brain, right brain, engineer and artist, that I think Inchbald excels in finding those students and then teaching them the language of design.
Fantastic. Such a good and comprehensive answer. That was really helpful. Thank you so much. I want to kind of go back a little bit. So you've sort of set the scene, Jacqueline, but just thinking about those kind of design trends that have happened over the 60 years that you've been part of, and how maybe the sort of antiques were merged, I think, very much, or melded, let's say, at the very beginning of Inchbald, and how that's maybe changed along the way. Because of course, as you mentioned actually on our prep sort of call, we talked about Terence Conran and the impact that he made, and he came along just 4 years after Inchbald. So how did that kind of sort of 60 years and how things have changed, and then what was the impact when someone like Terence Conran came in as well?
I think that Terence bucked the trend, really.
Yeah.
Because we were looking at an antique market. We were using antiques because not many people, I'm sorry, Staffan, not many people in England much liked Swedish furniture, which was of course beautiful at its best, but not so beautiful when it was the economy production that was produced in the war. And therefore, people like Michael Inchbald and also, of course, David Hicks were using antiques the whole time. And that, quite apart from the fact that their clients may well have been country houses. And I think that, you know, he was a revolutionary, Terence Conran. And it was like opening the door to another world the first time I walked into Habitat, because he actually was mad about texture. So you had the fun of that texture and color introduced into modern furniture. And he hunted Europe for, I would say, peasant artifacts. You know, he invented this whole boho thing without it getting into that terrible state of being boho, which I hate. But I mean, he invented the concept that you must look right down to the detail, the feel of something. You know, you put your hand across a glass table and it's very different to a wooden table. And all that he brought forward. And the other thing he did, this is a shopkeeper comment, he changed his layout practically every week. So I used to go every Saturday when the studio closed. I wandered down to Terence's to see what he was up to. And it was very invigorating and stimulating. He did change our view. He did.
And did you feel that in the school? Did the students kind of bring that into some of their work as well? Or were you going on a very different route with it?
It took a lot longer because he was marketing to a middle group, really, wasn't he? I hate this word class. It's so embarrassing. But, I mean, it's a middle financial market. And, you know, the upper classes were idle, actually. I disagree with Giles. And the other thing is, of course, they were living in interiors which had been done by Adam or Chippendale. Now, that's very difficult to buck that trend. You can't suddenly. But Michael would have happily put a plastic table into an Adam room. He would have been perfectly happy to do that. And so learning from him, which I did, I learned very early on to mix. I could go by in Conran. I had a coffee table. He bought a lot of panels of woven panels with them, the wooden frames. I don't know what the hell he was going to do with them, but he had something that went wrong. So he put legs on all of them and had coffee tables made. And my coffee table, which looked lovely because it was a woven finish, cost me 15 quid. Now that's very attractive because you've got an attractive object and new, different, you know, fashionable, and 15 quid. I know 15 quid was 2 weeks' wages in those days, but it still is bringing the whole concept of how manageable it is to make your house look better.
I think I wish I had one of those as well. I think I've got some Conran bits and some heels behind me that are from the 60s. I think amazing sort of just accent pieces.
Just to check quickly there. I think the point about people who live in large country houses which they've inherited and which their families have lived in for since the 18th century is because they've evolved. And because they've never actually had to do anything quite as vulgar as go and buy their own furniture, I think it's taken them a long time to realise that they need a little bit of help often with reorganisation. But I think that message has definitely got through.
It has now.
And Giles, just kind of going on from that, just I think because you sort of span and can see the history of it as well, I'm just thinking about we've talked about the impact that Inchbald had, and we might go back to Jacqueline for a bit more, but from your point of view, the kind of the professionalism of interior design in the UK, how did you see that evolve?
I think Jacqueline started with a blank canvas. I think what she has achieved is so much more than just set up a very, very successful and influential interior design school. She actually has created the industry as it is today. I still think that there's work to be done in terms of professionalising. I think that Inchbald graduates are absolutely exemplary in the way that they approach their profession, but I think there is still room for improvement. I interviewed Jacqueline earlier this year for Country Life, and one of the things she reminded me that people often forget is that interior design, good interior design, is really difficult, and I think too many people think it's a simple process that almost anybody can do, but you only need to do it yourself and to start making mistakes to realize that it's really important to have a professional on board.
So I think that actually moves very nicely to Staffan and Monique in terms of what do you see sort of next for the interior design profession, and how do you keep the professionalism in there, really? How do you?
Well, I think, like Jacqueline and Giles have both commented, it was not the Wild West, but it had to be kind of set up properly with the Inchbald and later on other schools as well. But I think the profession is growing up. It is taking on board, working closer with architects. we're doing a lot of architectural interior design at the moment, and you know, even though the beginning of our career we didn't even use CAD, and right now, you know, and I'm talking only about the last 15-16 years, every project is set up on CAD. We work very closely with shared drawings with the architect and the engineers on the project. So I think we've had to grow up in the organizational way, but you know, hopefully still keeping the kind of, you know, artist spark that actually, you know, got fired up in me when I joined Inchbald.
It's funny, one of our clients, when she wants to talk to us as a company and I take the phone call, she says, no, I don't want the organized one, I want the creative one. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm fine with that, I'm fine. But you know, to my point about, you know, Steph's first degree was in engineering, right? So, and we took this personality quiz recently where he emerged as the artist, and I don't know, mine was so boring, I think I've forgotten it, but it was essentially some sort of organizer stroke firefighter stroke collaborator. I think communication in interior design profession is so important, that actually just being an artist who's dictatorial, I mean, look, it might serve you quite well, but actually the ability to speak architect, the ability to understand the demands of the M&E engineer. You know, my favorite subject is not AV, and yet I have to speak it well enough in order to be able to understand my client's requirements and make sure that, you know, the 3 tenders that we're looking at from different companies actually answer that brief in the same way so that we can help them make a decision.
I wonder as well, actually, sorry, just thinking about the rapport that you have to build with your clients, how often they actually really, when you talk about taking their brief, how often they actually know what their brief is, or how, I mean, that must be quite an interesting sort of development of sort of extrapolating what they really mean when they express something.
Yes, I mean, we spoke today about a project that we have that has had to go very quickly at the initial stage, and it's unfortunate because you know, you need that time to really take a good brief. You need the time to prod them, to ask them questions, to spend time with them, and the whole conceptual phase that follows after the brief is important, that it takes the right amount of time. So, you know, we have clients that said, you know, we always say we don't want to work with a child's birth or Christmas as a deadline. But you know, get me in before Christmas. We've had so many times in the last 16 years. Yeah. But if you cut that initial, and it's a creative process, but also before the creative process, it's this very organized way of getting all of the information from the client. So I think, you know, we're both a bit right brain, left brain, but we're also kind of, we joke that we have one brain. So, you know, maybe you're more left and I'm more right.
I was just, sorry, go on.
No, I don't want to continue.
No, I was just wanting to pick up something also that Giles said, which was, you know, that the industry has a long way still to go, you know, that there's still improvement to be made. And I think back to our 15 years, you know, when we started with the project, the answer was yes. What's the question? And now I'm so much more confident to say, we'll need an acoustic consultant. Actually, we're going to have to run that past the structural engineer. I think we're going to need the contractor's advice on how he wants to tackle, you know, such and such. And I think actually, as interior designers, to be very confident in where we excel, where we should be spending our time helping the client, and not be scared to say to the client, this is a team, we are a design team, and that there are other people who will do that part of the work much more efficiently and effectively, because that's where they excel. This is what we're good at. And so that's been part of educating the client actually at the outset of a project.
So Jacqueline, just hearing that level of professionalism that comes with kind of confidence as you kind of grow into your agency, what do you think is or how do you keep that level of professionalism in a world that is pretty much dictated by Instagram and social media now? How do interior designers show their pedigree, if you like, against some of the influencers who are just kind of peddling their look on social media?
That's a tricky question for me to answer. I'm pestered by social media, and I think it's totally uninfluential. I can't see that it's doing much for interior design, if anything at all. What I do think is that she's picked up on this vital point of client-designer relationship, and to get down to the reality of the brief. You know, I'm going to have a little girl and I want it all pink. Well, it's a start, but it's a long way to go. And if you turn that into Staffan's study, for example, and I was doing that for Staffan, I'd go home and say, you do it yourself. But in fact, to learn about a personality, you have to do that in order to understand what the man is trying to explain to you. And without knowing him better, you won't get that. So empathy is just vital for a good interior design. Yeah. And I think lots of people in commercial design, let's say hotels and things, don't need that. So it doesn't matter. They come under the heading of developer. But once you're dealing with a person, and actually going back to a point that was made earlier, the great revolution in interior design and the comfort involved and all that kind of thing was generated largely by the hotels in America. And you know, the Americans came over in the war, and the differential in people's perspectives of Americans, some of whom were hugely uncivilized and some of them wildly civilized, but the actual perception of the American and the American culture changed visibly, and our own hotels became much more calm. Our hotels were dreadful. And it got to the point when, well, I took Amanda to Vienna once, and she flew around a very good hotel saying, they've got everything here. They've even got tissues in the box. And that, I've never forgotten that, right? And, you know, that attention to personal comfort was something that really came from the commercial side. And our hotels leapt into that breach. And then everybody wanted their houses to look like hotels because hotels were so comfortable. So you get this odd sort of domino effect in design the whole time. And it becomes fascinating. But you know, what you're going to say is what's going to happen to us after lockdown. So
well, well, no, what I was going to say was, and I was going to move to Giles actually, is that, you know, what's coming out of this conversation a little bit, is the Second World War as this kind of, you know, big, massive event changing from America to the UK. And clearly we're in another of those kind of seismic changes. So yes, you're absolutely right. I am going to move on to that. And I sort of wanted to start with Giles and kind of ask, you know, actually, I mean, a very basic question, but how do you see the trade is currently affected by the pandemic, and what do you kind of see? So we'll go on to trends and taste a little bit further down the line, but actually, you know, what's happening within the interior design and maybe the fabric manufacturers and everyone who surrounds that kind of in the heart of the pandemic, and what's going to happen next, do you think?
Well, all the interior designers I'm in touch with at the moment are very busy. They're all recruiting. So clearly, I think the experience of lockdown for their clients and their potential clients has demonstrated that their houses are much more important to them. They spent far more time there than they ever have done previously. And I think it's probably made people think that you know, their houses need to evolve. They need to incorporate spaces for working. They need to incorporate spaces for entertaining. I think, you know, you mentioned the Second World War. I think it's a very interesting parallel. After the Second World War, there was the Festival of Britain, and there was all this enormous optimism in design could be seen in the Homes and Gardens Pavilion there. I think the reaction to the pandemic will be less about style and more about creating good functional homes that are probably a little bit more timeless. That doesn't mean traditional, but I mean houses that will evolve and adapt to its owners' sort of needs and expectations.
Even including the pop-up classrooms that some of us have had to deal with, as well as our own desks. So moving on to you, Staffan and Monique, in terms of the sort of, I suppose you've been in the middle of it and actually getting quite a lot of commissions. As you said, you know, people are kind of calling up saying pre-Christmas, and they've obviously, we've all been surrounded by our homes and aware of what we want to improve or change. Do you think taste is going to be impacted? Are you seeing that?
I mean, firstly to say that we, like Giles commented, we are busy, and I've actually felt quite guilty about it, because you almost feel like you can't at the moment celebrate the kind of success of anything, because the world is suffering, and it's, you know, you have people losing their jobs left, right, and center. So we're very fortunate, I think, that maybe this in our client group are now spending more time, they're traveling less, they're spending all of their time at home, and they put more value, they're putting more value on their primary residence, and they want that to function perfectly. So I think that is completely correct. But in terms of I think it's more functional than style that will come out of it. I think you know, we've had years of not needing offices at home, because people say, well, you know, my broadband is better at the office, and I'm at the office every day. I don't need an office at home, and that's obviously come back to, we're looking at some beautiful home offices at the moment. I think well-being is another one. You know, you've not been able to go to the gym, so it's, how do I exercise at home? How do I look after myself and the family?
And hobbies,
yeah.
You know, places for music, kitchen gardens, you know, those sorts of things that you can do at home that maybe require a little bit of, not investment, but organization. We're seeing quite a few of those sorts of questions come up as well. We talk a lot about heat mapping the house. And so people, I think, are very aware of some of the areas that are bright red and just overused. So just being asked to shift other functions away from, you know, the shared kitchen dining area.
That's one thing I was going to say, actually, just thinking about this trend for open living spaces that has been such kind of big trend. But now that we've all been together, are people are asking to redefine and change those areas? Are they to have a little bit of their own space?
I think the sense of space is still what people want to feel in these wide open spaces, but I think it's more that there needs to be certain areas where you can go and close the door and do a Zoom call like this, or whether it's you know, concentrate on homework, or you know, you have all the family members being at home at the same time, has really, you know, made sure that you need to get as much as you can out of the house.
And Jacqueline, just you've sort of seen the span of so many decades. What do you think?
Quite put it like that, Freya.
Well, I think in terms of what I'm thinking is that going from, you know, kind of, we sort of talked about if you were lucky enough to have your Adam style home and how you decorate that, but actually through to a sort of chintz world, to the sort of toxic bachelor, to something that maybe is much more based on texture and craftsmanship now. What do you think is the kind of going to be the sort of the look of 2020? Is there going to be a common trend, or do you think it will actually be slightly more eclectic and personal because people have been spending time in their individual homes? Do you think it'll kind of bring a bit more confidence in people's own taste? and less trend related?
In the first place, the media, and I suppose we include this kind of thing, have been hugely great educators. And I think that the effect of being banged up in one house makes you look at everything. I mean, you may look at the garden and think you need a herb garden, but actually you look at the bits of furniture and you notice the details. And I think that I have to say that I think antiques will be given a better profile than they've got at the moment for that very reason. But the kind of thing that Habitat Conran was doing was exactly the same effect. That those post-war years, the sort of 50s, you know, everything exploded in the 60s, but that build-up had been building up since about 1945 with Deadsville, absolutely. I mean, those last the 5 years after the war, because there was nothing to buy. We weren't importing anything. People forget this, that the whole trade had curled up in a ball and died at our feet, literally. And so the designer could find nothing. I remember ringing America once. It's probably about 1955, in fact. And the man said, "From England? You're ringing from England?" And you know, it made you feel as if you were sitting on a rock in a silver sea. And they couldn't believe that we were beginning to import. They couldn't believe. They were quite difficult to deal with because they literally couldn't believe you were talking from London. And we were dealing with a very good, I can't remember his name, marvelous wallpaper firm. But you see, he was producing fabulous wallpapers. And then Coles came in with a very, very good designer who rearranged, who recolored, who rearranged the patterns. And to my shame, he died very early. And he put Coles on the map. He actually went to the archives. And a lot of people did that. They dug out archives of great elegance from the 30s. So you had a sort of rather backward-looking influence to start with. You know, we went in for these quite heavy wallpapers and things. And the Americans were doing wonderful finishes at the time. It all goes back to America. You see, it goes back to House and Garden in a big way. And Giles has just mentioned Homes and Gardens. I don't remember the Homes and Gardens, but I do remember the predominance of, if you like, architecture and engineering in those great presentations. And I'm more a designer decorator, so that I wasn't so excited. Michael worked on one of them. And one of the things that Michael said about his experience was that one of the designers, or two or three of the main designers, were brilliant designers, but had no sense of culture. That's important. It's terribly important because, you know, the antiques, I think people have killed off historic furniture with that word antique. I mean, for an 18-year-old to be, come on, do you want to be antique? And Michael hit the button because the education in this country was appalling in the arts, absolutely appalling. I went to a finishing school. Do you not want to know this?
No, tell me about the finishing school. I was going to ask you about something else, but go.
The finishing school, I and a girlfriend who both came from the same convent, and the convent education was terribly good because Catholics look at old masters all the time, of the Murillo and all that kind of thing. And I was mixing with girls from the top schools in London, England, and they'd never heard of Da Vinci. Come on. You see, you're so much younger, but I'm looking at girls who went through the smart schools, and they were so uncultured, I couldn't believe it. And so
just taking that point on and bringing the culture back in, something that you said before that I think is quite interesting, and it is looking at sort of antiques and I suppose the heritage of design is the sort of the grammar of the design world. What do you mean by that?
The grammar?
Yeah.
Well, If you sit down to play the piano, Freya,
Yeah.
are you going to learn what other people have done to the piano before you start? Don't you think it's important? Or
Yeah,
are you coming out of a clear blue sky as a genius?
No, yeah.
I think, you know, if you don't study what's gone before, you don't take any account of the mistakes they made. It is.
So I'm gonna, so to each of you in the panel, I'll kind of come round, but this kind of notion that our antiques are so important, but that it's a terrible word. How do we, I mean, you know, as an 18-year-old or a younger person, let's say, presumably one of the kind of great things about antiques, and this is maybe our job to be able to help educate people, is not only that they've kind of lasted, so they're made to last, so they're kind of, you know, with the beautiful sort of dovetail joints or whatever, but equally they're sustainable because we're not cutting anything down. We're just reloving and reusing or polishing something. So in terms of the kind of tick effect of what people want now, you can buy something that's one of a kind, that's sustainable, that's and that possibly has lasted a few hundred years and has got a few more 100 years in it left to go. So I think first to Giles, and then we'll go round. How do we make people understand that that actually is the ultimate in cool and on trend? Probably not using that word to start with.
I think there's more and more recognition amongst the younger generation of the extraordinary amount that good antiques deliver. And I think people are really shying away from living in spaces that are terribly homogenous, that look exactly like all your friends' houses or flats or whatever. And they realize that antiques offer a brilliant way to create an interior that's very, very distinctive. And actually, in many cases, a lot better value than what you could buy new. And I think also that the very exciting development is that people are beginning to realize that mixing antiques with modern furniture works perfectly well. The whole idea of having a kind of period piece where everything is of 18th or 19th century, that's completely gone. And I think it's created a much more sort of artistic approach to interior design, and that's really exciting.
Thank you. And Staffan and Monique, the same sort of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Giles is right. I think the juxtaposition of bringing in antiques is something that's incredibly difficult, but people are being more brave and requesting that in order to create a unique and personal interior. But I also think that the antiques are now going into modern antiques as well. So, you know, we look a lot at the 50s and 60s and 70s in Scandinavia and in America. So I think there's the whole idea of an antique is there is now something for everyone. So if you are after something more minimal and sleek, there are fantastic American and Scandinavian antiques from the 50s and 60s that might be exactly what you're after. So I think that it's a wider field now than before as well.
And you also work with sort of craftsmen, keeping certain sort of heritage and crafts alive in a way. Yeah, so the future antiques, but probably borrowing some kind of craftsmanship from the past, but sort of taking it into tomorrow. What do you think is your kind of antique of tomorrow, or the something that we should hold on to?
I'm constantly looking for it, and for me there's a bit of a split. That there are some amazing modernist artisans out there. Mark Albrecht is someone who studied art in Paris, but is now working in New York and is obsessed with steel. So everything for him, it comes from this one material almost. You've got Bassam Fellows that do this very mid-century inspired but new furniture, and I think the way they make pieces stand out, even though they're heavily inspired by the past, is something that they're going to be collectibles coming forward. And then I also love, you know, Lulu and what she's done at Sewn to, you know, to keep the kind of artisan and craftsman community alive in Britain. And I think she's, you know, heavily inspired by antiques, but some of the pieces that they produce will last for generations.
Thank you. I'm sort of conscious that time is going on and there's quite a lot of questions coming along. So I'm going to, in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Gillian to ask the questions. But one that I noticed that came up fairly early on, and I'd like to ask you, Jacqueline, is because you told the story about kind of buying the Terence Conran table that had obviously been sort of some panels that he didn't know what to do with, and sort of putting that into a fairly traditional antique filled room, if you like, and adding it and mixing things. If you're doing it the other way round and you've got quite a modern home at the moment, where would you start by kind of investing in antiques to kind of add into a...
I don't think you should ever invest in antiques.
Okay, invest is the wrong word. Where would you...
The wrong end, absolutely. It's not the wrong word because so many people do it.
Yeah.
My feeling about that is that you've got to do quite a lot of work, haven't you, going around the sale rooms and things, but you fall in love with something and you've got to have it. You fall in love with a dress, don't you? And you've got to have it, and then you've got to wear it. And the girlfriend said one day that her mother had said to her, if you're so keen to wear this ball dress, imagine wearing it in bed. And she said, it works every time. But in fact, having been a dealer with Michael, there are things you cannot resist. And then you create a modern setting for it. You know, it's not frightfully difficult. And it actually does go back to Terence's highlighting of texture and color too.
Yeah,
it really does, and that's an awful lot, of course, modern architecture too.
So basically, with that, you can mix every period and style if you've got the texture and color to kind of bring them together.
Well, I think so. I mean, like, you know, there's a common ground. She likes me. All 30 bits of furniture saying she likes me, actually. And it somehow, it brings it all together.
I love that. Okay, thank you so much. Gillian, do you want to take us through some of the questions?
Yeah, sure. We've got several. So one here asks, how does one go about appointing or selecting an interior designer? What should you look for?
Maybe should we start with Giles for that one, seeing as you've got the overview, the objective overview.
I think going back to points being made earlier, of course there are obvious things like looking at as much of their previous work and possibly actually visiting properties they've designed, as well as just looking at pictures if that was possible. But I think that this whole idea of rapport between the interior design and the client is absolutely vital. Communication and, as Jacqueline says, empathy are two of the most vital ingredients in any successful project. And I think that if you spend enough time with a designer before you appoint them, then I think you'll get a pretty good idea of how well you'll work together. It's a collaboration, and so you need to get on.
Thank you. I think I've just seen Gillian. Go on, Jacqueline.
I did quite a lot of photography, you know, because for the lecturing, and I went to something David had done one day, and I said to the client, he showed me this lovely interior for guests, and I said, you know, it's terribly overpowering. David always was overpowering, except for himself. And the man said, look, it's cost me a lot of money, and I want everybody I know to know that I can afford David Hicks. So that's another twist on empathy. I thought it was the most amazing thing to say, but you know, David actually did have a lot of clients like that. So,
and Staffan Staffan and Monique, so in terms of selecting designer, how do they find you?
Well, the best projects often come from word of mouth. Yeah. They've spent some time in an interior that we've done for a friend or something like that. But like Giles said, it's all about rapport at the early stages for sure. And you're kind of testing each other. You know, we're in a way we're kind of interviewing the client as well, because we don't want to embark on often our projects can last up to 4 years. It's a lot of time to spend with someone if you don't get on, and if it's not going to be enjoyable. So to a certain degree, we kind of interview the clients as well, not necessarily in a snobbish way, just simply that are we going to be able to do what it is they want, and are we going to get along, and are they going to be happy with the result? So it's time. And it's difficult, right? Because a lot of our clients don't have a lot of time. Yeah. We don't have a lot of time. So, but you've got to invest that time in the beginning, ideally before you're appointed.
Thank you. And Gillian, another one?
Yeah, sure. So this one asks, what is a design trend that each panelist wishes had not seen the light of day?
I love that one. I love that one. Who wants to start first with that one? Who's got one in their head already?
Boho.
And why do you hate boho?
Unstructured, unthought out, scruffy.
Yeah.
You know, the average design, if you take the Staffan's showroom, you know, it's immaculate. And that is what design is about. It's got to look good. It hasn't got to look as though you've stepped out of a chaotic fairyland. You know, with paisley wool shawls all over the sofas that is actually stained underneath the shawl. You know, I often imagine you see a boho room, you start pulling everything out, and oh dear, it's all very fine if you're a student on 5 shillings a week, but if you're moving into the design world, that discipline has got to pertain. Boho, it's my hate.
Okay. Who wants
I've
to
got
go
one.
next? Okay, go for it.
I don't know how to explain it, but I call it MDF dipped in gold. And it's basically, we had 20 years ago, anyone thought that you could cut anything, any shape out of MDF and then put an expensive finish on it. And it would be, you know, design furniture and should be sold for lots and lots of money. Ideally, with a few bits of crystal or diamante on it or something. But, and you know, we've talked about antiques and future antiques, and these were pieces that, you know, you scratched the surface and it was always MDF at the core, and they would last, you know, never mind 10 years, they would last 2 or 3 years, you know, and they would look sad and horrible, and it's just sad to see someone having done something bespoke. And then see, yeah,
that's my 4-letter word.
That's Monique's hate.
Can we bespoke it? No, we cannot, because it is not a verb. No.
But no, so that's my pet hate, and I think actually after I think people are wiser now in seeing that actually invest, well, the wrong word again, but spending the right amount of money on furniture also means that you want that furniture to live with you 10 years from now and live with someone 20 years from now if it's not you.
Like that. And Giles, have you got a pet hate as well?
Yes, the design trend that I like the least is the design trend. It's a modern phenomenon.
Yeah.
I blame frivolous journalists. I blame retailers. I blame PRs. Yeah. It's completely it encourages people to buy for the wrong reasons, and it ends up in an awful lot of stuff going into landfill. It shouldn't be encouraged, and I think that really what we want to get to is a point where people's interiors express their own interests and personalities rather than what they've just read in the pages of a glossy magazine.
That's true.
Fair enough. Gillian, one more. But
Yep, let me, sorry. So another person asked, who, besides the Tollgards, do you think are the most influential designers today?
Other people.
What did you do out there?
I'm not going to answer that one.
No, you have to answer someone else. While you're thinking, I'm going to say that one of the other comments I saw, it said it's not a question, but a massive congratulations to Jacqueline for all that she's done, was one of the other comments that came up. Who has one? Who has one ready in their mind?
I think a lot of credit is due to the designers at Colfax and Fowler, because over the last 20 or 30 years, whilst so many of us have been distracted by transitory trends, actually they've really stuck to their guns, and they've kept the candle of classic, timeless interior design burning. And now we're all, we're sort of beginning to realize the benefits of sticking to your guns and sticking to the idea of timelessness rather than being pulled in lots of different directions. So I'd say that they are, in their very quiet, discreet way, very, very influential.
Fantastic, thank you.
Can I say someone who influenced me a lot, and who kind of married, who brought Asia, and this is more recent, and brought Asia to Europe in a beautiful way, and sadly passed away this year, is Christian Legrave for me. I think he, across residential and hospitality, managed to create his own heavily Asian influenced design that I adored and still do.
Thank you. And Jacqueline, do you have a...
Well, I'm rather sad to tell you that I don't think, I'm not sad to tell you, the whole world of interior designing has blown up in the last 30 years. And in the first place, people have been educated by the media. In the second place, they've been educated by the Inchbald. And there is a huge number in this generation of extremely good designers. When I started, when I got married to Michael, there were 4. And John Fowler wasn't one of them, because he was not a creative designer. He was a terribly good decorator. And so you had Hicks, Sidley, Vandenberg, who was spectacular, and Michael. And they all used a mix. But now you have somebody like Staffan, who's brought his own culture very much to the fore, and is teaching us all that Scandinavia is the best. But there are so many about, and you see, you could talk about David Milinarik in terms of Fowler, but it's not yours and my decoration, is it? I mean, he's a great guru. We're getting down to personalities. I mean, actually, we used to employ him at Inchbald, and he's a great friend. I hope he's not listening to this. No. I mean, he does beautiful things, but they're not design. Are they, Staffan? Are they?
I think he is listening, so I'm not going to comment.
He might agree, because you see, really, he's a great historian. And that's his forte, and he does these marvelous reinvigorations of great houses. I mean, I was looking at his book last night, actually, and he must have done more beautiful houses than almost anybody living at the moment.
I'm going to ask one quick little, because it was one of the first questions that came in, and then we'll kind of close. But it's somebody read one of your recent articles, Giles, about colour in the kitchens, and loved it. And they say there's been a lot of bland, inoffensive design around for years. Will COVID bring a blast of colour as we all look for some vibrancy and cheer in our lives?
Well, I think, as we can see in the picture behind Monique and Staffan, that actually colour does bring joy to interiors, as it does, in fact, to yours, Freya. Not mine, I have to say. Exactly. And yes, I think the point is, I think people are going to create interiors that as I say, reflect their own individual taste rather than prevailing trends. And I think that can only be a good thing.
And Jacqueline, do you agree? Are we going to hunger for colour?
I always have. I'm afraid. I did Michael's drawing room in scarlet velvet, and I did my own dining room in scarlet velvet.
Nice.
And I can't stand washy colours, frankly. I really don't. But I think that life is very quick now, and life is very strong, and we're subjected to an awful lot of very strong advertising, very strong lighting, all that kind of thing. And that actually pushes you into more demonstrative choices of colour and texture. Keep on going about texture and colour and so on.
No, it's good. I like it. Well, on
I think
that,
specifically on the
Go on,
kitchen,
Staffan.
as what I was going to say is that I think we have had decades of kind of white kitchens and etc. And I think actually even before the lockdown and so on, we see more character in the kitchen, and and I think what now, kind of post lockdown, I think kitchens should be used, and they should be cooked in, and people have been using their kitchens much more. They haven't been going out to restaurants. So not just color, but actually life. You know, it's okay to have things out. It's okay to have, you know, to grow herbs on the counter. It's okay to use it. It shouldn't be this thing that is just this kind
laboratory.
Laboratory in the middle of that's not, you know, that has to look perfect at all times.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think we're already overrunning slightly, so it's time to say thank you and goodbye. So thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations, Jacqueline, again on the Inchbald reaching this landmark anniversary. And again, I'm really sorry that we couldn't be doing this at the LAPADA fair, and then we could all have a glass of Gusbourne now, as you know. So that's a shame, but we can do that another time. So thank you very much. Thank you to you for joining us, and also to Cultural Comms for helping kind of put this together for us. And we will return on the 15th of October to do a webinar looking at the sweet spot between art and fashion. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye, Freya. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.